Hi, this is Mr. Cordes, and today, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to talk and discuss about poetry. We're also going to take a look at poetry terms. For poetry, people normally fall into two categories. You either love poetry or you hate poetry, and it's okay to hate poetry. It's okay to love poetry. But for the next couple of weeks, we're going to study poetry simply because we need to understand this form of literature. Poetry and poems, it's a condensed form, a concise form of literature. And so we want to be able to analyze it, pull it apart, and understand what the speaker is saying, what the poet is trying to communicate, and really just kind of grasp onto this particular style of literature. So, looking at our poetry terms for today, these are terms that we'll need to take in focus notes. So you'll need a piece of paper and set up your page. You can pause the video now if you need to. But these notes are going to be beneficial for us when we analyze, as well as our quizzes. So if you check the calendar, you will notice that there is a poetry terms quiz. And then later on in another lecture video, there'll be a poetry type or types of poetry quiz. So that will come later. But right now we're going to focus on poetry terms and what poetry is and kind of just begin to understand it. As we progress through, when we do analyze poetry together, we'll need to know these terms. So if I ask you to find the alliteration, we'll need to make sure that we find the alliteration. If I ask us to talk about the end rhyme or the internal rhyme, we need to be able to identify what that is and find it in our poem. So as we go through, mark down these items on your notes. I'm going to be going back and forth between some examples, kind of showcasing what this actually looks like. It's one thing to talk about an alliteration. It's another to see it in a poem. So most of these terms will be review for you. Hopefully in the past English language arts classes, you have studied or worked with poetry in some capacity. Our goal now is just to kind of be exposed to poetry, understand it, analyze it and look at it and begin to identify, hey, here are the differences. This is the different style I see. This is the different techniques, or we're going to do some compare and contrast as we progress through. But with all that being said, one of the first websites that I've got up here that you're seeing on your screen is the poetryfoundation.org. This is a free website that you can go to that offers you a vast amount of poems. It's just a large database of poetry. And you can go here, look up a poem, look up a poet, and it'll give you information. There's a place where I go and you click on it and it takes you to like the poem of the day. So that's where we currently are right now. We're at the poem of the day. It's not one that I selected, but it's the one that we're going to use for some of our examples. But take a moment, pause the video, make sure that you've got your page of notes set up so that you can get that credit. But I want to talk to you guys about what poetry is. So looking here, and you guys can mark this down in your notes, poetry is the most compact form of literature. I mentioned that previously. It's a most compact or most concise form of literature. The ideas and emotions are kind of delivered differently. So if we were to read the Scarlet Ibis, we've got a long narrative, lots of examples. It's a story format, not necessarily a poem format, but the emotions and the ideas could correspond if it was in a shorter, compressed type packaging. So what you're looking at with poetry is you're looking at the meaning of the sounds of the words, the line breaks, the empty spaces is all designed to create an effect or to convey a message or an experience. So when we look at a story, we can look at the framework, the narrative that goes back and forth, word choice, and all those things. But when we look at poetry, we look at the whole thing. In regards to punctuation, we look at poetry for the sounds and what do the sounds communicate. We look at imagery. Imagery is the five senses. We look at capitalization. We look at punctuation. I think I just said that. I think I said punctuation twice. However, we look at the whole thing. We look at the whole piece of the poem together. So if you were going to take a look, let me come over here. This is a poem by Emily Dickinson. It's called There's Been a Death in the Opposite House. You'll even just looking at this poem, you'll notice first and foremost that it's broken up into a stanza of 4 lines. Okay. You'll notice that some words are capitalized and others are not. So I've got the word doctor is capitalized, children is capitalized, neighbor is capitalized, today is capitalized. You'll also notice that there are dashes. That is very, very distinct and purposeful for Emily Dickinson in how she writes. And the dash communicates something much differently than a semicolon or a comma or even a period. So we have to look and analyze everything within a poem. So when we are studying, let me skip back over here. So let's say that we're taking a look at this poem. This is called Unusual Warm March Day Leading to Storms. That's the poem of the day. You'll notice if I was going to scan through this first, it's one long stanza. There are several dashes, which means it's probably there's some sort of significance behind it. Sentences end with a period. Some of them are inside of a line and some of them are at the end. So that's something else that I'm going to make a note of. And then we also have specific word choice. So we're going to pull up and look at all of those things as we go through. So let me come back over here. So poetry, okay, tightly compressed emotions and ideas. We've got the meaning and the sound of words, the line breaks, empty spaces, everything is used to convey a message. So some of the things that we need to look at, which I just mentioned, and the items that are in bold are probably the ones that you want to make note and or keep notes for the quiz later, as well as when we do our analysis of poetry. So the distinct way a poem is laid out on the page is called the poem's form. So the very first poem, our poem of the day, is the form is one stanza, okay, one long stanza. If I was to go back to the Death in Opposite House, we would notice that there's several stanzas. We even notice that there's one stanza that's just one line, which is probably significant, okay? So there's lots of ways that we can look at form. So what is the form? How is it presented? You'll even notice, you may have done this in elementary school, but there's poetry that's known as shape poetry, in which you write a poem in the shape of the item that you're talking about. So if you're talking, you write a poem about an empty house, you may, put the poem in the lines of a house or whatever. So the form is the way that the poem is presented. Stanzas. If it's a sonnet, it'll be a larger chunk of lines, and then it'll have a couplet down at the end. There's lots of different ways that you can have form, okay? Poems are usually divided into lines, okay, which may or may not be sentences. You guys remember this from Romeo and Juliet, is that a sentence would carry on to the next line. In some poems, lines are arranged in groups called stanzas. So they're chunked together, and then the term is called stanza. A poem's stanzas may have the same number of lines or varying a number of lines. Each stanza plays a part in conveying an overall meaning of the poem. So from this page right here, you've got the word form, you've got the word lines, you've got the word stanza. Let's make sure that we have a definition for those. And feel free to pause at any time for you to catch up with the writing. I know I'm talking pretty fast. If I'm looking at our poem of the day, Unusual Warm March Day, the form is one long stanza. Okay, we'll notice that some of the sentences carry on, some of the lines are broken up. We would just say that this is a one stanza poem. Okay, but I would need to know and read through the poem to understand why is it presented in such a thin way, a thin line, so to speak, versus keeping a sentence connected This is where I would begin to analyze the poem as far as rhyme scheme, internal rhyme. I'd begin to analyze for other components that we'll talk about in just a moment. So some things that we need to look for. There's rhyme, which is the likeness of sounds at the ends of words. And then there's internal rhymes, which is a rhyming word that's found within a line. This is a little bit more rare. Longer poems will have internal rhyme. Really, really good poets strive to have some form of internal rhyme. But rhyming is essentially, one right after the one, or one letter rhymes with the other. The frog sat on the log next to the dog. Okay. That's an end rhyme poem. You have a word that rhymes because of the similar sound. So if I was to start this one, it says, everything is half here like the marble head of a Roman empire and the lean torso of his favorite. Now we may read that sentence and it doesn't sound like there's any end rhyme, right? Here, emperor, head, torso, favorite. Everything is half here like the marble head of the Roman empire and the lean torso of his favorite. There are a lot of vowels. So in my mind, I'm going to think, okay, what's the internal rhyme? And usually internal rhyme is vowels because every word has some sort of vowel in it. I'm going to continue to read to see what is the internal rhyme and if it matches. So does the FA for favorite connect with the MR for marble? Or does the HALF half correspond with the favorite or the I'm gonna try to understand what's going on. And this is where people lean towards hating poetry. They're like, well, I don't understand, I don't get it, I don't know. And it's fine if we don't know, but our goal is and we don't have to swing the other way, like, oh, this is the best poem ever. I look up the poem every day. I don't look up the poem every day. But we've got to find a place where we're able to analyze it. So those are things that I would begin to look for. So the way the funnel cloud, which doesn't seem to touch the ground, does, flips a few cars, a semi, we learn to walk miles above our bodies. So here, the cloud and ground, those would be an internal rhyme because it's got the same OU sound, okay? Our bodies here, so that would be an example of like internal rhyme, okay? So we have rhyme scheme, internal rhyme. End rhyme is the example I gave about the frog, okay? There was a frog who sat on a log next to the dog. The rhyme scheme is at the end of the line. So if I was reading a poem, it would be, actually, let me scroll down, see if I've got a whole bunch of poems here. So here's one by William Shakespeare. When my love swears that she is made of truth. When my love swears that she is made of truth, I do believe her, though I know she lies, that she might think me some untutored youth, unlearned in the world's false subtitles. Subtitles? How do we say that? I'm going to copy that word. I'm going to double check that word. We already know right here, truth and youth. Those words rhyme. Okay. If I'm mispronouncing, which is a common thing to do, I need to see if this one lies and goes right there. So this is what good scholars do. We investigate. So subtleties. I was way off, wasn't I? Subtleties. I looked at that word and saw like sublets, which is not what so subtleties. So lies, subtleties, the e's at the end, we could make a connection there. Okay. So I've got youth, truth, youth. Have you got young, best, subtleties, best, tongue, young. Okay, tongue and young. That would. Suppressed. Okay, best. So right here, I'm checking out the rhyme scheme. What I just did for subtleties is a perfect example of what you guys can do. There is no shame in the game if you have to go and look at a word and check pronunciation. I don't know every single word in the English language. That's fine. I didn't major in dictionary. I majored in literature. You guys can do the same thing. You read a poem, you're like, I have no idea what this word means. Let's look it up. We did that with Shakespeare. We didn't know what a word means. We figured out what was the historical context. What does it mean now? How is it relating? How is it being used? And then you figure things out. So, subtleties. Okay. Subtleties. So, I'm going back and forth. So here's our poem of the day. Our next component that we have here, we had end rhyme. A pattern of end rhymes in a poem is called the poem's rhyme scheme. So I will ask you in certain poems, what is the rhyme scheme? Okay. To describe a rhyme scheme, you can assign each line a letter of the alphabet, starting with A, and then the first line is you assign the letter after that. So if we were looking at this one from Shakespeare, I would mark down truth and youth. So truth would get an A at the end, and youth would get an A at the end. Okay. Because subtleties and lies doesn't necessarily connect as well as we want it to, we would put a B and then a C. So then young would be a D. Okay. Best. And so that's where we kind of begin to connect. I would always recommend working with a pencil because then you can erase. I'll help you with figuring out rhyme schemes because it's a very it's a tricky sense. It's a tricky pattern to find. So it's kind of like in your math class or your science class when they ask you to like find the formula or find what's matching or what's similar. It will be the same thing here for poetry. So we'll look at a line, kind of go stanza by stanza, what is rhyming and what is not, and then label it with those letters. That's all it is, a rhyme scheme. Okay. Rhythm is the pattern of sound created by the arrangement of stressed and unstressed syllables in a line. And when you put them all together, that's the rhythmic pattern or the meter. So the rhyme helps build the rhythm, and then the rhythm is called the meter. So when you are going through poetry and you're able to read it 2 or 3 times or 4 times, you begin to find the rhythm. How does it flow naturally? Okay. If I was to go and read through this poem, this is a cold read for me. Cold read means this is the first time I'm reading it. I haven't reviewed it. I haven't practiced it. If I read through this as a cold read, obviously I'm fumbling over words. I'm trying to figure out what rhymes. I can't hear the rhythm until I further get into it and practice and go through. So if I'm going to ask you to read a poem 2 or 3 times, you're going to read a poem 2 or 3 times, whether that's to yourself or to someone else. So if I was to come back up here for the death of an opposite house, we would do the same thing. There's been a death in the opposite house as lately as today. I know it by the numb look such houses have always. The neighbors rustle in and out. The doctor drives away. The window opens like a pod, abrupt, mechanically. Even in these 2 stanzas, you guys can hear the rhythm that's being happening. You could also notice it either here where I fumbled over the word mechanically is because it didn't have that rhyme. And Emily Dickinson is actually putting that word in there so that it will sound more mechanical than rhythmical. So it's a little trick that she does right here to kind of help us feel the uncomfortableness of when the neighbors are rustle in and out of houses. The doctor drives away. There's been a death. We don't know all of the things, and it comes off very mechanically. Okay. So that right there is the rhythm that creates the pattern. Okay, using the stressed and unstressed syllables, and then you get the meter, which is the rhythmic pattern. So some of these you will have already in your notes. Some of you will not. So let's take a moment to make sure that we get them down. Alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds at the beginning of the word. So the cat crawled up the cuckoo clock. That right there, the hard K sound is my alliteration. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds in non-rhyming words. So the ship in distress that cannot live. That I sound that you hear is an assonance. It's the repetition of a vowel sound. Okay, so those are our first two terms. Those deal with sound. Whoops, let me go back here. Consonants. Consonants is the repetition of a consonant sound within or at the end of the words. So it's the repetition of R and the D. And but the father answered never a word. So the never a word answered the ER-ED and the RD right here. That's the consonants. It's a consonant sound. Okay, so it's not a vowel, it's a consonant, and it's repeating itself in at the end of a word or within the word. Okay, automatopoeia. That's a great one. That's a word that simply sounds the way it is spelled. So if something were to thump on the ground, it's exactly how it's spelled out, and it's as well as it sounds like the reference itself. So buzz sounds exactly like a buzz. Okay. Hiss sounds exactly like the hiss sound. Okay. So those are some components. If I were going to look through these, I would look for the internal rhyme. Okay. Maybe I've got, let's see, I already talked about the AR or the A sound in here. Let me go down to another one. The pig farms dissolved in the small hills. So I've already got an I, the I in pig, the I in dissolve, the I in hills. Okay. Ruin seemed larger, a charred palace from the gaze tunnels through and through. So I've got a lot of R's that I could reference too. Okay. And those are the things you pick up. Oh, wow, there's a lot of R's in these words. Maybe that's something. And as you begin to practice and reread poetry, you begin to pick up on those different little nuances. Okay. And that's how we analyze poetry. Now, one of the things to note is that there's, just like when we read a story, there's the author and then there's the narrator. Sometimes, or more than likely, they are two separate people. Sometimes they are the same. For us, it's the same in poetry. In poetry, you have the poet, but then you also have the speaker of the poem. And sometimes the speaker and the poet are the same person, and sometimes they are not. So the speaker of a poem is the voice that relates the ideas of the story. The speaker is not necessarily the poet. Poets sometimes write as themselves, speaking directly to the poet. So sometimes that does happen in itself. Okay. So speaker, let's real quick. We've got two items of figurative language, imagery. Okay. Hi, let's talk for a second. Imagery is not creating an image. Imagery is using the five senses to create a more descriptive and detailed image. So if I told you that the boy bit into the apple and the juice dripped off the side of his mouth as he tasted the sweetness of the fruit, you are picking up on your taste, maybe even the sound, like the crunch of the apple. You're picking up on the feeling of food on your face. That right there is sensory imagery. Okay, the five senses. So that's where you pick up on sight, hearing, smell, taste, or touch. Okay. Now, figurative language. There's three types of figurative language, and that will be on the next slide. This communicates an idea not in an ordinary or literal meaning. This is the beyond. So when we talked about, let's use Doodle from the Scarlet Ibis. Doodle became this symbol, or excuse me, the Scarlet Ibis became a symbol for Doodle, right? We found the similarities. We understood how each other felt. There was a lot of empathy between those two. But figurative language goes beyond, and it's not literal, okay? It's not literal at all. So the three components that we're going to talk about and discuss in our poetry unit, personification. This is where there's attribution of human qualities to an object, animal, or idea. Okay. A lot of people think like Beauty and the Beast and all of those inanimate objects come to life. That is a form of personification, but personification still goes towards things that are not purposefully enchanted or being turned into human-like creatures. So if I said the sun threw down its beams upon the earth during the hot summer days, the sun is not throwing down. Throwing down is a human action. So the clouds felt guilty for covering the sun. The clouds don't feel guilty. Those are the components. So when you write something out, you're giving human-like attributes to an inanimate object. Okay. A simile is a comparison indicated by the word like or as, and then a metaphor is a direct comparison. So the room is a war zone, right? The room is a disaster. It is a direct comparison as to where a simile uses the word like or as. So the classroom is like a pigsty because it's so messy, right? Those are the different types of figurative language that we're going to have for our unit. So if I come back over here to the poetry of the day, and I go through, there was, I believe, a simile that I saw somewhere. Everything is half here, like the marble head of a Roman empire and the lean torso of his favorite. That right there is a simile because they use the word like. So everything is half here. So they're referencing to the fact that there's a torso there of a Roman statue, but not necessarily the head, right? Or the head is just there and the arms and the legs are cut off. It's incomplete. So that's how they're connecting with everything is half there, all right? The way the funnel cloud, which doesn't seem to touch the ground, this could be a form of personification maybe, where the funnel cloud touches, right? Touching is a human attribute. We learn to walk miles above our bodies. The pig farms dissolve, then the small hills, as in dreams. This right here is a simile. So the pig farms dissolve, then the small hills, as if they're like being removed and being taken away, as in dreams, fraught with irrecoverable gestures and ruined sets seemed larger. Holy cow, this is a dry, cold reading. I apologize. And charred palace of the gaze tunnels through and through. Obviously, I can't pick up on the rhythm or the rhyme right now because I'm fumbling over words because this is the first time I'm reading it. When we read our poetry, we'll do it several times, and I think I already mentioned that. But those are the components that we see. So these are some of the things that we're going to be doing. If I go over here to my Death in the Opposite House, I'm going to focus on what is being said. What are we trying to communicate? What is my poet saying? Why is there'll be a dark parade separate from everything else? What does that have to do with the fact that there's been a death? What are they implying, right? Milliner, what is a milliner, right? Does that coincide with his type of house? There's mourners over here, but it's a capital M. So what does that mean? What is actually happening in these sentences, in these stanzas, in these lines of poetry? So we're going to go through today. Your goal, ladies and gentlemen, make sure that you have notes for everything on the PowerPoint slides that I showed you. If you need to go back and make sure that you all have them down so you can study for the quiz, please do so. I'll challenge you right now to go over to poetryfoundation.org and look up the poem of the day and see if you can do that for any of the components that we just talked about. Yes, that was a lot of information. I hope it was beneficial. If you're lost or confused, just let me know. We will get through poetry together, okay? The idea of us analyzing poetry, pulling it apart, practicing, fumbling over words, trying to figure out what are they trying to mean, what are they trying to say, that's what we're going to do. That's what the next couple weeks are, is really kind of almost getting our hands dirty, to use a metaphor. we're going to get our hands dirty with poetry. So take a moment, make sure you've got all of your notes. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns, and I will talk to you later.